The Rise and Fall of the Ottoman Empire and World War I. Introduction. For more than 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful empires in the world. At its height, it controlled vast territories across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The empire ruled over important cities such as Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, Baghdad, Damascus, and Jerusalem, making it a major political, economic, and cultural force. However, by the early 20th century, the once powerful empire was facing serious challenges. Internal political struggles, economic problems, and military defeats had weakened its authority. When World War I began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire made a decision that would ultimately shape its fate. By joining the war on the side of the Central Powers alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, the empire hoped to restore its strength and regain lost territories. Instead, the war would lead to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and completely reshape the political map of the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire before the war. Before World War I, the Ottoman Empire was already in decline. Throughout the 19th century, the empire had lost large areas of land in Europe and North Africa. Many territories gained independence or were taken by European powers. Because of its weakening power, the empire was often called the sick man of Europe. Despite this decline, the empire still controlled vast regions, including modern-day Turkey, large parts of the Middle East, sections of the Arabian Peninsula, and parts of the Balkans. In 1908, a political movement known as the Young Turks took control of the government. Their goal was to modernize the empire and restore its military strength. The new leadership believed that joining a powerful ally in the coming war could help secure the empire's future. Why the Ottoman Empire joined World War I. At the start of World War I, the Ottoman Empire initially tried to remain neutral. However, several factors pushed it toward an alliance with Germany. Germany had been helping the Ottoman military modernize and had invested heavily in the empire's infrastructure, including railways and military training. Many Ottoman leaders believed Germany would win the war quickly. In October 1914, Ottoman warships attacked Russian ports in the Black Sea. This action officially brought the Ottoman Empire into the war on the side of the Central Powers. Soon after, Britain, France, and Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire at war. Once the empire entered the war, fighting quickly spread across several fronts. The Ottoman army faced battles in many regions, including the Caucasus, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, and the Middle East. These campaigns placed enormous pressure on the empire's military and resources. The Gallipoli Campaign. One of the most famous battles involving the Ottoman Empire during World War I was the Gallipoli Campaign. In 1915, Allied forces led by Britain and France launched a major attack on the Dardanelles, a strategic waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea. Their goal was to capture Constantinople and open a supply route to Russia. The Allies believed Ottoman defenses would collapse quickly. However, Ottoman forces mounted a strong defense. Under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, Ottoman soldiers successfully resisted the Allied invasion. The fighting at Gallipoli lasted for months and resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. Eventually, the Allies were forced to withdraw. For the Ottoman Empire, the victory at Gallipoli became a powerful symbol of national pride. The war in the Middle East. While the Ottoman Empire achieved success at Gallipoli, the situation in other regions was far more difficult. In the Middle East, the British Army launched several campaigns to weaken Ottoman control. British forces advanced through Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and captured important cities such as Baghdad. Meanwhile, the British supported an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. Arab leaders, including Sharif Hussein of Mecca, rebelled against the empire with British support. One of the most famous figures involved in this campaign was T.E. Lawrence, often known as Lawrence of Arabia. The revolt weakened Ottoman control over the Arabian Peninsula and disrupted supply lines. The Caucasus Front. Another major conflict occurred on the Caucasus front, where Ottoman forces fought against the Russian Empire. Early in the war, the Ottoman army launched an attack against Russian forces in a campaign known as the Battle of Sarkamish. However, the operation ended in disaster. Harsh winter conditions and poor planning led to massive casualties among Ottoman troops. Thousands of soldiers died from freezing temperatures and starvation. The defeat severely weakened Ottoman forces in the region. The collapse of the empire. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was facing overwhelming pressure. Years of war had exhausted its military, weakened its economy, and caused widespread suffering among civilians. Allied forces continued advancing through the Middle East, capturing cities such as Jerusalem and Damascus. At the same time, Germany and Austria-Hungary, its main allies, were beginning to collapse in Europe. Without support from its allies, the Ottoman Empire had little chance of continuing the war. In October 1918, the empire signed the Armistice of Mudras, officially ending its participation in World War I. The armistice allowed Allied forces to occupy important strategic locations within Ottoman territory. For the empire, it marked the beginning of the end. The night in captivity. As evening fell, the farmhouse command post grew quieter. The constant movement of soldiers slowed. Radios still crackled in the other rooms, but the intense activity of the afternoon had faded into a tense silence. The prisoners sat alone on a wooden chair inside a small room with a single dim light hanging from the ceiling. Outside the door, 2 German guards stood watch. For the first time since the encounter in the forest, he finally had a moment to think. Not about fear, but about time. In war, time is often more valuable than weapons. Every hour that passed gave his fellow soldiers more distance, more safety, more opportunity to deliver their report and prepare for whatever operation might come next. And that thought alone made the situation easier to endure. The Germans still wanted answers. Later that night, the door opened again. The older German officer entered, carrying a small notebook. He pulled up a chair and sat across from the prisoner. This time, the questioning was slower and more deliberate. Instead of repeating the same questions, the officer began connecting details from earlier conversations. He mentioned the forest patrol, the footprints, the strange behavior of the man who had walked out of hiding. Then he asked a direct question. Why did you step out? For a moment, the room remained silent. It was an unusual question because it wasn't about military information. It was about the decision itself. The prisoner could have invented another story. He could have continued pretending that he was lost or separated from his unit. But instead, he simply said something simple. Someone had to. The officer stared at him for several seconds. In that moment, he likely understood the truth. The man sitting in front of him had sacrificed his own freedom so others could escape. And even in war, soldiers sometimes recognize courage, even in their enemies. A war already beginning to change. Outside the farmhouse, the larger war was moving in a direction the German army could no longer fully control. By this stage of World War II, Germany was facing enormous pressure on multiple fronts. Allied forces were advancing, supply lines were weakening, and the once unstoppable German war machine was beginning to show cracks. But soldiers in the field often didn't see the entire picture. They only saw the next mission, the next patrol, the next prisoner. For them, the war continued one small moment at a time. And tonight, that moment centered on the captured soldier sitting in the small farmhouse room. The possibility of transfer. The following morning brought new orders. German command posts often moved prisoners to larger facilities for longer interrogations. Officers trained specifically in intelligence gathering would take over questioning. The guards informed him that he might soon be transferred to another location. For many prisoners, that journey was the beginning of months, sometimes years, in prison camps. but the soldier remained focused on the one fact that mattered most. The mission had succeeded. Whatever happened next, the decision he made in the forest had already achieved its purpose. The soldiers who escaped never forgot. Days later, far from that farmhouse, the men who escaped gathered with their commanding officers to discuss what had happened. They described the moment in the forest, the German patrol approaching, the sudden decision of their comrade to step out of hiding. At first, the officers listening to the story were stunned. It was the kind of action rarely written in official reports because it relied entirely on personal courage rather than formal orders. But the result was undeniable. The patrol routes had been exposed, enemy movements had been confirmed, and an important piece of intelligence had reached Allied command. One officer finally said something that captured the entire story. He saved the mission. The power of the unexpected. In war, strategy often focuses on numbers: more soldiers, more tanks, more weapons. But moments like this remind us that human decisions can sometimes matter as much as military strength. The German patrol expected enemies to hide or run. They expected fear. They did not expect a man to walk directly toward them and calmly start a conversation. That single unexpected decision changed the outcome of the encounter. And sometimes in war, surprise is the most powerful weapon of all. A story that lives beyond the battlefield. Years later, when the war finally ended, many stories of courage began to surface. Some involved massive battles. Others described famous generals. But some of the most powerful stories were much quieter. Moments where one person made a choice that protected others. This was one of those stories. Surrounded by German soldiers, facing almost certain capture, he made a decision that no one expected. He stepped forward, not to fight, not to escape, but to give others the chance to survive. And because of that choice, the mission and the men behind him lived on. What became of the soldier? The days after his capture passed slowly. The Germans kept him under guard, moving him between small temporary posts as the front lines continued shifting. Interrogations continued, but they produced little useful information. Every officer who questioned him eventually reached the same conclusion. He knew something, but he was not going to reveal it. In many cases during World War II, prisoners like him were eventually transferred to larger detention camps deeper behind the front lines. These camps held thousands of captured soldiers from different Allied armies. Life in those camps was difficult. Food was limited, conditions were harsh, and the uncertainty of the war made every day feel longer than the last. Yet, compared to the battlefield, the camps also meant something important: survival. For many captured soldiers, being held as a prisoner of war meant they had at least escaped the constant danger of artillery, air attacks, and frontline combat. The war outside the camp. While he remained in captivity, the war outside continued to move quickly. Across Europe, the balance of power was changing. Allied forces were advancing across multiple fronts. German units were being pushed back step by step, losing territory they had once conquered with speed and confidence. Supply shortages began to affect German troops. Fuel became scarce. Vehicles broke down more often. Communication between units grew more difficult. What had once seemed like an unstoppable military force was slowly weakening, and every new Allied advance brought one important possibility for prisoners held inside German camps: liberation. The day when everything changed. For months, the prisoner heard distant sounds of war. Sometimes it was artillery far away, sometimes the low rumble of aircraft passing overhead. The guards grew more nervous with each passing week. Rumors spread among prisoners that Allied forces were moving closer to the region. Then, one morning, the sound came again, but this time it was louder. Artillery explosions echoed in the distance. German soldiers rushed through the camp, shouting orders and moving equipment. Something major was happening.
Within hours, the guards began to prepare to move prisoners away from the area. Many camps were evacuated during the final stages of the war as German forces tried to prevent prisoners from being freed by Allied advancing armies. But events were moving too fast. Before the transfer could begin, Allied troops reached the area. The fighting around the camp was brief but intense, and when it ended, the gates were opened. For many prisoners, it was the first moment of real freedom they had experienced in months. Freedom after the war. When the soldier finally stepped outside the camp as a free man, the world looked very different from the one he had known before the war. Entire cities had been damaged or destroyed. Millions of people across Europe were trying to rebuild their lives after years of conflict. But for him, the most important thing was simple. He had survived. Eventually, he reunited with fellow soldiers and returned home. Stories of the war were shared slowly over time, sometimes with friends, sometimes with historians who wanted to understand what had happened during those chaotic years. Among those stories was the moment in the forest, the moment when he stepped out of hiding and walked directly toward a German patrol. Why his decision still matters. Many heroes of war are remembered because of large battles or famous victories, but sometimes the most powerful acts of courage happen in small, quiet moments that almost no one sees. A decision made in seconds, a risk taken without hesitation, a sacrifice made so others could escape. When the German patrols surrounded that forest path, most soldiers would have tried to run. He did something different. He stepped forward, and by doing so, he created the confusion that allowed his comrades to escape and complete their mission. The lesson from that moment. War is often described through weapons, strategies, and military strength. But stories like this remind us that wars are also shaped by individual choices. One person, one moment, one